On the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, a French chateau rises above the Atlantic Ocean. Its limestone walls have witnessed Gilded Age splendor that made European royalty envious. Its ballrooms once hosted America's wealthiest families during lavish summer parties that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Today, students walk through the same grand entrance where millionaires once arrived in horse-drawn carriages. The great hall where society gathered now welcomes prospective students and their families. Where servants once prepared elaborate dinners for hundreds of guests, university administrators plan the academic year. This is Ochre Court, and its journey from palace to campus is one of the most remarkable transformations in American architectural history. The mansion was built by a family whose fortune rivaled the Astors. They hired the most celebrated architect in America. They spared no expense on materials imported from Europe. They created a summer home so magnificent that a Russian Grand Duke declared he had never seen such luxury. But wealth alone could not guarantee the survival of Ochre Court. The man who built it would die just 5 years after its completion. His children would face impossible choices as the world changed around them. The palace that cost millions to construct would eventually become a burden that money could no longer sustain. What saved Ochre Court was not another fortune. It was a different kind of vision entirely. If you enjoy stories about America's grandest mansions and the families who built them, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore the Gilded Age and the extraordinary buildings that defined an era of unimaginable wealth. This is the story of how education saved what opulence could not preserve. Chapter 1: A Palace Reborn. Walk along Newport's famous cliff walk on any given afternoon, and you will encounter dozens of historic mansions perched above the Atlantic. Some are museums now, others remain private homes, but one stands apart from all the rest. Ochre Court does not charge admission. It does not rope off its rooms or post guards at its doors. Instead, it invites visitors inside to experience something that would have been unthinkable to the family who built it. The palace has become a working university campus, and its transformation tells us something profound about wealth, legacy, and what truly survives. The mansion rises 3 stories above Ochre Point, its limestone facade catching the light that gave this stretch of coastline its name. Ochre refers to the golden yellow clay found in the cliffs below. The Gilded family, who commissioned this chateau in the late 1880s, chose the name deliberately. They wanted their summer home to belong to this landscape, even as they imported European grandeur to American shores. When construction finished in 1892, Ochre Court ranked among the most expensive private residences ever built in the United States. The final cost reached $4.5 million. Adjusted for inflation, that sum exceeds $150 million in today's currency. For that investment, the Gildeds received 50 rooms spread across more than 40,000 square feet of living space. Only one Newport mansion surpassed it in size. The Breakers, built by the Vanderbilt family, would claim that distinction 3 years later. But size alone does not explain why Ochre Court matters. Newport had no shortage of wealthy families competing to build the grandest summer cottage. What makes this particular mansion significant is what happened after the parties ended and the servants departed. The Gilded family occupied Ochre Court for barely half a century. 3 generations passed through its halls before the weight of maintaining such a property became impossible to bear. By the 1940s, the world that had created places like Ochre Court had vanished. 2 world wars had reshaped society. The Great Depression had humbled even the wealthiest families. Estate taxes consumed fortunes that once seemed limitless. Robert Gilded, grandson of the man who built Ochre Court, faced a choice that confronted many heirs of Gilded Age mansions. He could sell the property to developers who would demolish it for the land. He could watch it decay while searching for a buyer who might never come. Or he could find another path entirely. He chose the third option. In 1947, Robert Gilded donated Ochre Court to a Catholic religious order seeking to establish a women's college in Rhode Island. The gift transformed not just the building, but its entire purpose. Where society matrons once presided over elaborate dinners, nuns would soon teach literature and philosophy. Where debutantes had danced beneath crystal chandeliers, young women would study for examinations. The transition was not merely symbolic, it was physical and complete. Every room in the mansion found a new function. The grand spaces that had hosted Newport's elite became classrooms and dormitories. The servants' quarters that once housed a small army of staff became living space for faculty. Even the basement, where provisions had been stored for summer entertaining, was converted into practical use for the new institution. Today, Ochre Court serves as the administrative heart of Salve Regina University. The building anchors a campus that has grown to include multiple historic properties along the Newport coastline. Visitors can walk through the same entrance that welcomed Gilded Age guests more than a century ago. They can stand in the Great Hall and look up at ceiling murals that took European craftsmen years to complete. They can glimpse, if only briefly, the world that created such places. But they will also see something the original owners never imagined: students crossing the lawn between classes, faculty members discussing curriculum in rooms designed for formal entertaining, wedding receptions in spaces built for an entirely different kind of celebration. The contrast raises questions that this documentary will explore. Who were the Goëlets, and how did they accumulate the fortune that made Ochre Court possible? What drove them to build on such an extravagant scale? Why did their ownership prove so brief? And what forces conspired to make the mansion a burden rather than a blessing? Most importantly, how did a building designed to showcase one family's wealth become an institution dedicated to educating generations of students? The answer involves ambition and tragedy, rivalry and loss, and ultimately a decision that preserved what might otherwise have been destroyed. The story begins not in Newport, but in Manhattan. It begins with real estate, and with a family whose land holdings made them one of the wealthiest dynasties in 19th century America. Chapter 2: Manhattan Empire. The fortune that built Ochre Court did not come from railroads or steel mills or oil fields. It came from something far more patient. It came from land. The Goëlet family arrived in America in 1676, nearly a century before the nation itself existed. They were French Huguenots, Protestants fleeing religious persecution in Catholic France. Like thousands of other refugees, they sought freedom in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. Within a decade, that colony would become New York, and the Goëlets would begin accumulating the property that would make their descendants extraordinarily wealthy. Early generations of Goélets were modest craftsmen. Peter Goëlet, who arrived as a young man, worked as an ironmonger, selling hardware and metal goods to the growing colonial settlement. He saved what he earned and invested in the only asset that seemed certain to increase in value. He bought land. Manhattan Island in the late 17th century was largely wilderness beyond the southern tip, where colonists had established their town. Property could be purchased cheaply, and Peter Goëlet acquired parcels whenever he could afford them. He had no way of knowing that the island would eventually become the most valuable real estate on Earth. He simply believed that land, unlike money, could not disappear. This conviction passed from father to son across 5 generations. Each Goëlet inherited property from the previous generation and added to it during his own lifetime. They never sold, they leased. A building might burn down or fall into disrepair, but the land beneath it remained, and its value only increased as the city grew northward. By the middle of the 19th century, Goëlet holdings had become remarkable. The family owned property throughout Manhattan, from commercial lots in the bustling downtown to undeveloped land in what would become fashionable residential neighborhoods. Their strategy remained unchanged from Peter's original insight. They collected rent from tenants, maintained their properties carefully, and reinvested their income in additional land. Another Peter Goëlet, born in 1800, consolidated this empire. He never married and devoted his entire life to managing and expanding the family holdings. While other wealthy New Yorkers spent millions on mansions and entertainment, Peter lived modestly and focused on acquisition. He became known as one of the shrewdest real estate operators in the city, a man who could assess a property's potential value decades into the future. Peter had 2 nephews, Ogden and Robert, the sons of his brother Robert Goëlet Sr. These young men would inherit everything their uncle had spent a lifetime building. Peter groomed them carefully, teaching them the principles that had guided the family for 2 centuries. Patience mattered more than speed. Ownership mattered more than display. The land itself was the foundation of everything. When Peter Gilded died in 1879, his nephews inherited an estate valued at approximately $40 million. This sum alone would have ranked them among the wealthiest men in America. But they also inherited something more valuable than cash. They inherited 259 properties scattered across Manhattan, generating rental income that grew larger every year. Only one family owned more of the island. The Astors, who had begun acquiring Manhattan real estate a generation earlier than the Goëlets, held the largest portfolio. But the Goëlets ranked second, and unlike many wealthy families who diversified into railroads and manufacturing, they remained focused almost exclusively on their original source of wealth. Real estate had made the family rich. Real estate would keep them rich. Ogden Goëlet, born in 1851, was 28 years old when he inherited his share of the family holdings. His brother Robert received an equal portion, and the 2 men continued the partnership that their uncle had established. They divided responsibilities according to their temperaments. Robert preferred the quiet work of managing properties. Ogden possessed different ambitions. By the time of the inheritance, Ogden had already married well, started a family, and established himself in New York society. The new wealth freed him to pursue grander ambitions. He wanted something that even $40 million could not automatically provide. He wanted recognition. He wanted to build something that would announce to the world exactly who the Goëlets were and what they had achieved. Other families had already begun this competition. The Vanderbilts were constructing mansions along Fifth Avenue that transformed the Manhattan streetscape. The Astors entertained in ballrooms that could hold hundreds of guests. If the Goëlets wished to claim their place among the true elite, they would need to make a statement equally bold. Ogden found his opportunity not in Manhattan, but in Newport. The Rhode Island resort had become the summer capital of American wealth, a place where the nation's richest families gathered each year to escape the city heat and display their prosperity. The grandest families built summer cottages there, though cottage hardly described estates that rivaled the great houses of Europe. The Goëlets already owned property in Newport. They had summered there for years, observing the escalating competition among their neighbors. Ogden decided the time had come to enter that competition himself. He would build a summer home that reflected not just his current wealth, but the centuries of patient accumulation that had made it possible. He would build Ochre Court, but first he needed to find the right architect, and he needed to find the right wife to preside over such an establishment. He had already accomplished the second task. His marriage had connected him to one of the most remarkable families in America during this era of extreme wealth. That family's story begins in Tennessee. Chapter 3: The Marrying Wilsons. Mary Wilson did not come from old money. Her family had earned their fortune during the chaos of the Civil War, and New York society never let them forget it. Her father, Richard Thornton Wilson, had grown up in modest circumstances in Georgia. He possessed a talent for business and an instinct for opportunity that would serve him well when the nation tore itself apart. While other Southern men marched off to fight, Wilson positioned himself to profit from the conflict. He sold provisions to the Confederate Army, negotiating contracts that made him wealthy while his countrymen died on battlefields. When the war ended, Wilson found himself in an awkward position. He had grown rich from Southern suffering, and the defeated South had no use for profiteers. He moved his family to New York, hoping to reinvent himself among people who cared more about money than its origins. He brought with him a fortune estimated at several $1 million and 5 children who would need to make their way in a society that viewed them with suspicion. New York's established families did not welcome the Wilsons. The old Knickerbocker elite, descendants of Dutch settlers who had lived on Manhattan for generations, considered Southern newcomers vulgar. The accusations of war profiteering followed Richard Wilson everywhere. His money might gain him entry to certain circles, but his reputation would always precede him. Wilson understood that his own social position could never fully recover. His children, however, might succeed where he had failed. If they married well, they could wash away the stain of their father's wartime dealings and establish themselves among the American aristocracy. He raised his sons and daughters with this goal firmly in mind. The strategy succeeded beyond anything Wilson could have imagined. His children became known as the Marrying Wilsons, a nickname that captured both admiration and envy. One by one, they contracted alliances with the most powerful families in America and Europe. The eldest daughter, May, led the way. Born in 1855, she grew into a striking young woman with dark hair and sharp intelligence. She met Ogden Goelet through the overlapping social circles of wealthy New York, and their courtship followed the expected pattern of their class. They married in 1877, when May was 22 and Ogden 26. The match made perfect sense from both sides. The Goelets gained a beautiful and socially ambitious wife for their heir. The Wilsons gained access to one of the oldest and most respected fortunes in New York. If anyone whispered about Richard Wilson's past, the Goelet name provided sufficient cover. May's siblings followed her example with remarkable success. Her sister Belle married Sir Michael Herbert, a British diplomat who would eventually serve as ambassador to the United States. The marriage connected the Wilsons to European aristocracy and opened doors that American wealth alone could not unlock. Her brother Orm achieved something even more impressive. He married Caroline Astor, known as Carrie, the daughter of William Backhouse Astor, Jr., and the legendary Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Mrs. Astor, as the mother was universally known, served as the undisputed queen of New York society. Her approval determined who belonged and who remained forever outside. For Mrs. Astor to accept a Wilson as a son-in-law meant the family had finally arrived. The youngest sister, Grace, completed the family's social triumph. She married Cornelius Vanderbilt III, heir to the greatest railroad fortune in American history. The Vanderbilts had more money than almost anyone, but they had struggled for decades to gain acceptance from older families who considered them nouveau riche. The Wilson-Vanderbilt marriage united two clans who each possessed something the other wanted. Through these four marriages, the children of a suspected war profiteer connected themselves to the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and the British aristocracy. Richard Thornton Wilson's gamble had paid off spectacularly. His grandchildren would inherit not just money, but social position that no scandal could shake. May Goelet understood her role in this family project. She had married first, proving that the Wilson children could attract partners of the highest caliber. Now she intended to demonstrate that she deserved her place among the elite. She would not simply be Mrs. Ogden Goelet. She would become one of the most formidable hostesses of her generation. Contemporary observers recognized her ambition and her skill. One Society columnist described her as the vice-regal leader of the ultra-fashionable 150, a smaller and more exclusive circle than even the famous 400 that Mrs. Astor claimed to command. May did not merely attend parties. She determined who else would be invited. She did not follow fashion. She influenced it. Her husband's fortune gave her the resources to compete at the highest level. The Goelet real estate empire generated income that could fund any entertainment she wished to stage. But money alone did not explain her success. May possessed the intelligence to navigate complex social hierarchies and the determination to overcome any obstacle. When Ogden decided to build a summer palace in Newport, May saw an opportunity to establish herself definitively among the American elite. The mansion would be more than a home. It would be a stage for her ambitions, a setting worthy of the social position she intended to claim. She would help select every detail, from the architect to the furnishings, ensuring that Ochre Court reflected not just the Goelet wealth, but the Wilson drive for recognition. The partnership between Ogden and May would shape everything about the mansion they created together. He brought the fortune. She brought the vision of how that fortune should be displayed. Together, they would build something that announced their arrival among the very highest reaches of American society. But Ogden had interests beyond social climbing. He loved the sea, and he had formed friendships that would take him far from New York and Newport alike. Chapter 4: The Yachtsman. Ogden Gourlay could have spent his life managing properties and collecting rent. The family holdings required attention, and many wealthy heirs devoted themselves entirely to preserving what their ancestors had built. But Ogden wanted more than ledgers and lease agreements. He wanted the open water. From an early age, Ogden fell in love with sailing. The sensation of wind filling canvas, the rolling motion of a deck beneath his feet, the vast horizon where sky met sea. These experiences spoke to something deep in his character. While other millionaires collected art or racehorses, Ogden collected yachts. He became one of the most accomplished amateur sailors of his generation, competing in regattas and crossing oceans in pursuit of his passion. His early boats gave way to increasingly ambitious vessels. By the 1880s, Ogden had commissioned a yacht that would become legendary in American maritime circles. He named her Mayflower, a name that evoked the founding of the nation itself. The ship measured 273 feet from bow to stern, making her one of the largest private vessels afloat. Steam engines powered her across the Atlantic without dependence on favorable winds. Mayflower was not merely a boat. She was a floating estate, equipped with staterooms, dining facilities, and every luxury that contemporary technology could provide. Ogden spared no expense on her construction and maintenance. He employed a full crew of professional sailors and engineers to keep her ready for departure at any moment. When business in New York grew tedious or the summer heat became unbearable, he could escape to sea within hours. His favorite destination lay 3,000 miles away. Cowes, a small town on the Isle of Wight off the southern coast of England, had become the unofficial capital of international yachting. Every August, the world's wealthiest sailing enthusiasts gathered there for Cowes Week, a regatta that attracted royalty and millionaires in equal measure. Ogden became a regular presence at these events, racing his yacht against the finest vessels in Europe. It was at Cowes that Ogden formed a friendship that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of Americans. The Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne and future King Edward VII, shared Ogden's passion for yachting. The two men found themselves in the same social circles, attending the same parties, competing in the same races. A genuine friendship developed between the American real estate heir and the man who would one day rule the British Empire. This relationship represented something remarkable about the era. For centuries, European aristocrats had looked down on American wealth as vulgar and new. The great families of England and France traced their lineages back hundreds of years, while American fortunes were barely a generation old. But by the 1880s, American money had grown too significant to ignore. Men like Ogden Gourlay could meet princes as equals, bonded by shared interests rather than separated by birth. The friendship brought Ogden into the most exclusive circles imaginable. He dined with members of the British royal family. He attended events at residences that tourists could only glimpse from outside iron gates. He moved between two worlds, as comfortable in a London drawing room as in a Manhattan boardroom. Few Americans of his era achieved such access to European nobility. Back home, Ogden's social position was equally secure. In 1892, the self-appointed arbiter of New York society published a list that would become infamous. Ward McAllister announced the names of the 400 families who truly mattered in American high society. The number supposedly reflected the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom, though McAllister's actual list contained only around 300 names. Ogden Gourlay appeared on that list without question. His family's wealth, his marriage to a Wilson daughter, and his own social accomplishments made his inclusion inevitable. Unlike many names on McAllister's roster, Ogden did not need to campaign for recognition. The Goulets had been prominent in New York for 2 centuries. They belonged. Yet Ogden understood that social position required constant maintenance. Families who rested on inherited reputation eventually found themselves displaced by hungrier newcomers. If the Goulets wished to remain at the pinnacle, they would need to demonstrate their standing in ways that commanded attention and respect. Newport provided the perfect stage for such demonstrations. The Rhode Island resort had become a summer theater where America's richest families performed their prosperity for one another. Each season brought new mansions, new parties, new attempts to outshine the neighbors. Ogden had watched this competition for years. He had seen wealth transformed into limestone and marble, into ballrooms and gardens that rivaled anything across the Atlantic. The time had come for him to enter the contest. His wife May had the ambition and the skill to manage a great household. His resources could fund any project he chose to undertake. His social connections from New York to London guaranteed that the right people would notice whatever he built. All he needed was an architect capable of translating his vision into reality. He needed someone who understood both American ambition and the elegance of the Old World. He needed someone who could build a chateau on the cliffs of Newport that would make even the Prince of Wales feel at home. He needed Richard Morris Hunt. Chapter 5. Hunt's French Dream. Richard Morris. Hunt had spent his life preparing for clients like the Golets. No other architect in America possessed his particular combination of training and talent. His journey from a small Vermont town to the most prestigious architecture school in Paris had given him tools that no American-trained builder could match. Born in 1827 in Brattleboro, Vermont, Hunt lost his father at a young age. His mother moved the family abroad, believing that the Old World offered educational opportunities unavailable in their home country. The decision would shape her son's entire career. In Paris, the young Hunt discovered architecture. The city itself served as his first classroom, its boulevards lined with buildings that demonstrated centuries of accumulated knowledge about proportion, ornament, and grace. Medieval structures stood beside Renaissance palaces, each neighborhood offering lessons that no American city could teach. By his early 20s, he had decided to pursue architecture formally. He applied to the École des Beaux-Arts, the most prestigious architecture school in the world. No American had ever studied there. The institution trained architects who designed government buildings, museums, and monuments across the continent. Its graduates shaped the physical fabric of Paris, London, and Rome. Admission required exceptional talent and determination. Hunt gained entry in 1846, becoming the first American to walk those halls. He spent nearly a decade in Paris, first as a student and then working alongside established architects on major commissions. He learned to draw with precision and think with clarity. His instructors taught him that architecture was not merely construction. It was art with a purpose. Historical styles dominated the curriculum, particularly the French Renaissance. Hunt spent hours sketching the chateaux of the Loire Valley, those magnificent country houses built by French kings and nobles in the 15th and 16th centuries. Chenonceau, Chambord, Blois. These names became touchstones for his imagination. Their turrets and dormers, their elaborate stonework and dramatic rooflines represented an ideal of aristocratic living that had never existed in America. When Hunt returned to the United States in 1855, he carried this vision with him. America had money, but lacked architectural tradition. Wealthy citizens built homes that imitated Greek temples or Italian villas, borrowing forms without fully understanding them. Hunt believed he could offer something better. He could bring the sophistication of classical design to clients who possessed the resources to build properly. Early commissions proved difficult to secure. Americans were not accustomed to hiring architects as creative professionals. They wanted builders who would follow instructions, not artists who would impose their own ideas. Hunt persisted, taking whatever work he could find while waiting for the opportunity to demonstrate his true capabilities. That opportunity arrived with the Vanderbilts. William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva wanted a residence that would announce their arrival among New York's elite. Hunt delivered a limestone chateau that transformed American domestic architecture. Nothing like it had ever appeared on an American street. Critics praised its sophistication. Society marveled at its boldness. Other millionaires immediately wanted something similar for themselves. Commissions flooded in from clients eager to build their own versions of French grandeur. By the time Ogden Goulet approached him, Hunt had become the most sought-after architect in America. His portfolio included mansions, museums, and monuments. He had designed the base of the Statue of Liberty, the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and dozens of private residences for the wealthiest families in the nation. No other architect possessed his combination of Parisian credentials and practical American experience. Ogden wanted a summer home that would establish the Guillets among Newport's elite. He had watched other families build impressive cottages along the coastline, each one grander than the last. He needed something that would surpass them all, a residence that would make visitors understand immediately that they had entered the home of one of America's great families. Hunt proposed a chateau. Not a modest interpretation of French style, but an authentic recreation of Loire Valley magnificence adapted for the Newport setting. The building would rise from the cliffs above the Atlantic, its limestone walls catching the light that gave Ochre Point its name. Every detail would reflect the highest standards of craftsmanship executed by artisans brought from France and Italy. Architect and client shared a vision of what the mansion should accomplish. It would not merely house the Guillet family during Newport's summer season. It would make a statement about their place in American society. It would demonstrate that their wealth, accumulated patiently over generations, had produced people of taste and refinement equal to any aristocrat on the continent. May Guillet participated actively in the planning. She understood that the mansion would serve as the stage for her social ambitions, and she wanted every element to support the impression she intended to create. Hunt welcomed her involvement. Successful projects required collaboration between architect and client, particularly when the client possessed clear ideas about how they wished to live. Together, the three of them developed plans for a residence unlike anything Newport had seen. Hunt drew on his decades of training and experience. Ogden provided the financial resources to realize the most ambitious designs. May ensured that practical requirements of entertaining and daily life received proper attention. The project would take years to complete. It would require skilled craftsmen, materials shipped across the Atlantic, and coordination among dozens of specialized contractors. The cost would be extraordinary even by the standards of Newport's wealthiest residents. None of this deterred the Guillets. They had waited generations to build something worthy of their position. They would not compromise now. Construction began in 1888. The cliffs of Ochre Point would never look the same. Chapter 6. Building the Chateau. Ground broke at Ochre Point in the spring of 1888. What rose from those cliffs over the next 4 years would require an army of craftsmen, shiploads of materials, and coordination that tested the limits of 19th century construction. Hunt's design demanded stone. Not the brownstone common to New York townhouses, but limestone of exceptional quality that would glow golden in the seaside light. He specified blue Indiana limestone, quarried in the American Midwest and shipped by rail to Rhode Island. The James Sinclair and Company received the contract to cut and lay this stone, a task requiring precision that few American firms could guarantee. The material arrived in massive blocks that had to be carved on site. Skilled stonecutters shaped each piece according to Hunt's detailed drawings. Window surrounds, cornices, balustrades, and ornamental flourishes emerged from raw stone under their chisels. The facade alone required thousands of individual pieces, each one fitted to its neighbors with joints so tight that mortar became almost invisible. Behind that exterior skin, modern engineering provided the skeleton. Hunt employed a steel frame, a relatively new technique that allowed buildings to rise higher and span greater distances than traditional masonry construction permitted. The steel arrived from foundries in Pennsylvania, each beam fabricated to exact specifications before being hoisted into place. This hidden structure would support not just walls and floors, but the enormous weight of the decorative elements that would eventually cover every surface. The site itself presented challenges. Ochre Point jutted into the Atlantic, exposed to salt spray and winter storms that could damage lesser buildings within years. Hunt designed foundations that anchored deep into the bedrock, ensuring that his creation would stand for generations. Drainage systems channeled water away from the structure. The orientation of rooms took advantage of ocean views while protecting the most formal spaces from harsh afternoon sun. As walls rose, the scope of the project became visible from the cliff walk below. Curious Newport residents watched the structure take shape month by month. 3 stories climbed toward the sky, punctuated by dormers and chimneys that gave the roofline a distinctly French silhouette. The central entrance featured a massive arched doorway flanked by columns, announcing to visitors that they were about to enter someplace extraordinary. Landscaping began before construction finished. The Olmsted brothers, sons of Frederick Law Olmsted, who had designed Central Park, received the commission to transform 13 acres of coastal property into grounds worthy of the mansion. They created formal gardens in geometric patterns, terraces that descended toward the ocean, and pathways that revealed carefully composed views at every turn. Mature trees were transplanted to provide immediate shade and privacy. The grounds would require a staff of gardeners to maintain, but the effect justified the expense. Work continued through winters, when other construction projects shut down. The Guillets had set an aggressive timeline, and delays cost money. Craftsmen labored in temporary shelters, shaping stone and wood while snow fell outside. Each spring revealed progress that seemed almost impossible given the conditions. But the most remarkable feature of Ochre Court would remain invisible until the building neared completion. Hunt had designed something that no Newport residents had ever possessed. He had planned for electricity. In 1890, most American homes still relied on gaslight and candles. Thomas Edison had demonstrated his incandescent bulb only a decade earlier, and electrical infrastructure remained primitive. Cities were beginning to install generating stations, but private residences rarely attempted full electrification. The technology was expensive, unreliable, and poorly understood. The Guillets decided to install their own generating station on the property. A dedicated building would house steam engines and dynamos capable of producing enough current to illuminate the entire mansion. Copper wiring ran through ceilings and structural cavities to fixtures in every room. When completed, Ochre Court would contain 1,200 electric lamps. To understand what this meant, consider that the entire town of Newport possessed only 200 electric lights at the time. A single private residence would have 6 times the electrical capacity of the surrounding community. Visitors entering Ochre Court after dark would experience illumination unlike anything they had seen in a home. Chandeliers would blaze with steady, clean light. Wall sconces would glow without flickering. The smell of burning gas would be entirely absent. This technological achievement carried social meaning beyond mere convenience. Electricity represented the future, and the Guillets intended to show that they belonged there. Their mansion would not simply recreate aristocratic splendor from centuries past, it would demonstrate mastery of the most advanced innovations available. Tradition and progress would coexist beneath the same roof. By late 1892, exterior work reached completion. The mansion stood above the Atlantic exactly as Hunt had envisioned, its French profile unmistakable against the New England sky. Sculptural details by Carl Bitter adorned the facade. Ironwork gates marked the entrance to the grounds. The generator hummed in its outbuilding, ready to bring the interior to life. That interior represented the next phase of transformation. While the exterior announced the Guillets' presence to Newport, the rooms within would reveal the full extent of their ambitions. Teams of decorators had already begun their work, importing materials and expertise from France and Italy. What they created inside would leave even royalty speechless. Chapter 7. Palace of Light. Visitors entering Ochre Court for the first time often stopped in the doorway, unable to move further. Rising 3 full stories from floor to ceiling, the Great Hall demanded that reaction. Here was a declaration of wealth and taste on a scale that few Americans had ever attempted. Every surface drew the eye upward through layers of increasing richness. Gilt-carved wooden arches spanned overhead, their surfaces catching and multiplying the electric light. Above them, a domed ceiling displayed a painted mural featuring heraldic shields and classical figures, the work of artists brought from Paris specifically for this commission. Guests were meant to feel small in the presence of such grandeur. The design achieved exactly that effect. At one end stood a fireplace that predated the mansion by 3 centuries. Ogden and May had acquired an authentic 16th-century stone mantelpiece from a French chateau, and shipped it across the ocean for installation in their Newport home. Carved figures and intricate ornamental details covered its surface, each element bearing the patina of genuine age. No reproduction could have achieved the same effect. The fireplace anchored the room in history, suggesting that the Gildeds belonged to a tradition far older than their American fortune. Jules Allard et Fils, operating from Paris, bore responsibility for much of this splendor. The firm had decorated palaces and mansions throughout Europe before turning their attention to wealthy American clients. They understood how to create interiors that communicated status through every surface and object. For Ochre Court, they coordinated teams of craftsmen working in wood, plaster, fabric, and metal, ensuring that each room achieved a unified aesthetic despite the complexity of its elements. Ellen, Kitson, and Company handled the ornamental woodwork that appeared throughout the mansion. Their artisans applied precious metal leaf to carved surfaces with techniques perfected over generations. Each layer had to dry completely before the next was applied, and the final burnishing demanded a steady hand. Door frames, cornices, and decorative panels gleamed with warm light that no paint could imitate. Beyond the Great Hall, each major room offered a different interpretation of aristocratic style. Morning light filtered into a breakfast room decorated in the manner of Louis XV, that 18th-century French monarch whose reign had produced some of history's most refined decorative arts. Painted panels depicted pastoral scenes. Furniture featured the cabriole legs and subtle ornamentation characteristic of the period. Here was a space designed for intimate family gatherings rather than formal entertainment. Ogden's study took an entirely different approach. Dark wood paneling created an atmosphere of masculine seriousness, while murals inspired by Hans Holbein portrayed Tudor-era scenes. This was a room for conducting business, for reading correspondence, for private conversations away from the social obligations that dominated Newport summers. For dancing and large gatherings, German Rococo style governed the ballroom. Elaborate plasterwork framed enormous mirrors that doubled the apparent size of the space. When filled with guests, the room would multiply their movements into infinity, creating the impression of a celebration far larger than the actual gathering. Musicians could perform from an elevated gallery while visitors circulated below. On summer evenings, with every fixture blazing, the ballroom achieved an almost theatrical brilliance. A Gobelin tapestry dominated the dining room, woven at the famous French manufactory that had supplied royalty for centuries. Such tapestries rarely appeared on the open market. Acquiring one required connections, patience, and substantial funds. The Gaullets possessed all three. Historical scenes played out in colors that remained vibrant despite the passage of decades, a testament to the skill of the weavers who had created it. Room after room revealed similar attention to detail and expense. Guest chambers featured different decorative schemes, allowing occupants to choose atmospheres that suited their preferences. Service areas, though hidden from public view, maintained standards of quality that lesser mansions reserved only for show spaces. Even corridors and staircases received ornamental treatment worthy of a formal reception hall. Here was proof that sufficient money, combined with educated taste and access to the finest craftsmen available, could create interiors equal to any aristocratic residence on the continent. Skeptics who questioned whether American wealth could rival the great houses of Europe found their answer at Ochre Court. One visitor understood this better than most. Grand Duke Boris of Russia toured Newport during its summer season, curious to see how American millionaires lived. He had grown up surrounded by the treasures of the Romanov dynasty. He had walked through the Winter Palace and the great estates of Russian nobility. He knew what genuine magnificence looked like. After experiencing Ochre Court, the Grand Duke offered his verdict. He had never dreamt of such luxury as he had seen in Newport. Word of his assessment spread quickly through society circles on both sides of the Atlantic. Coming from a man raised among the riches of Imperial Russia, the praise validated everything the Gaullets had attempted. They had not merely built a large house. They had created something that impressed even those born to splendor. But Ochre Court did not exist in isolation. Just down the coast, another mansion was rising simultaneously, designed by the same architect for clients equally determined to dominate Newport society. The Guillets and their rivals were about to discover that they were engaged in a competition neither had fully anticipated. Chapter 8: The Newport Rivalry. Richard Morris Hunt found himself in an impossible position. His two most demanding clients wanted to build simultaneously in the same resort town on the same stretch of coastline. Both expected his complete attention. Both intended to outshine the other. And both had hired him before realizing they were rivals. William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva had approached Hunt first. Their success with the Manhattan residence had convinced them to attempt something even more ambitious in Newport. Alva in particular possessed strong opinions about architecture and society, and she wanted a summer home that would establish her family's dominance over the resort. She envisioned a marble palace inspired by the Petit Trianon at Versailles, a building that would make every other Newport cottage look modest by comparison. Hunt accepted the commission and began developing plans in 1887. Within months, the Guillets approached him with their own Newport project. Hunt faced a choice. He could decline the second commission and maintain exclusive loyalty to the Vanderbilts, or he could accept both projects and manage the inevitable tensions that would arise. His reputation and his finances both pointed toward acceptance. When ground broke at Ochre Point in the spring of 1888, construction at the Vanderbilt site began almost simultaneously. Two enormous mansions rose within sight of each other, each designed by the same architect, each intended to surpass everything Newport had seen before. Hunt traveled between the sites, adjusting details, resolving problems, and somehow keeping both clients satisfied. Alva Vanderbilt named her creation Marble House. The title announced her intentions plainly. While other Newport mansions used limestone or wood, hers would feature 500,000 cubic feet of white marble imported from quarries she had personally inspected. The material cost alone exceeded the total budget of most substantial homes. She did not care. Marble represented permanence, purity, and classical authority. Her house would possess all three qualities in abundance. Architectural styles reflected the personalities of the owners. Hunt designed Ochre Court as a French chateau, romantic and picturesque, its roofline animated by dormers and chimneys. Marble House took inspiration from a later period, the formal classicism of 18th century France. Clean lines and symmetrical facades replaced the exuberance of the Renaissance style. Both approaches demonstrated mastery of historical precedent. Neither could be called superior to the other. Inside, the stakes rose higher. Alva demanded interiors that would overwhelm visitors with precious materials and masterful craftsmanship. Her ballroom featured bronze panels designed by Carl Bitter, the same sculptor who had contributed to Ochre Court. Hunt found himself specifying similar decorative elements for rival houses, trusting that the overall effect would differ enough to satisfy both parties. The Guillets understood what they faced. May Gillet had married into a family that considered the Vanderbilts aggressive newcomers, railroad money that had pushed its way into society through sheer spending power. The struggle carried personal weight beyond mere architectural display. Losing to the Vanderbilts would represent a defeat for older, more established wealth against the brash fortunes of the industrial age. Cost became another measure of the contest. Ochre Court had seemed extraordinarily expensive when construction began. Marble House would ultimately cost more than $11 million, nearly triple the Gillet investment. Alva Vanderbilt had overwhelmed her rivals financially, a fact that Newport society noted with a mixture of admiration and horror. Yet money alone did not determine the outcome. Both mansions achieved exactly what their owners intended. Visitors to Ochre Court experienced warmth and grandeur, rooms that invited lingering and conversation. Visitors to Marble House confronted magnificence of a colder sort, spaces designed to impress rather than comfort. Each approach found its admirers. Hunt managed to complete both projects by 1892. The achievement represented a triumph of organization and diplomacy as much as architectural skill. He had satisfied two families who despised each other, delivering buildings that each could claim as a victory. The Guillets possessed their chateau. The Vanderbilts possessed their marble temple. Newport possessed two new landmarks that would define its character for generations. Hostilities did not end with construction. Each summer season brought fresh opportunities for confrontation. Parties at one mansion demanded response from the other. Guest lists became weapons. Invitations carried political significance that outsiders could barely comprehend. The women who presided over these households understood the stakes perfectly. Every entertainment was a battle in an ongoing war for social supremacy. May Golay entered this arena with advantages and disadvantages. Her Wilson family connections had placed her siblings in the Astor and Vanderbilt households, giving her intelligence about her opponent's plans. Her husband's fortune, while substantial, could not match the seemingly limitless Vanderbilt resources. She would need to prevail through taste and strategy rather than pure expenditure. Ochre Court gave her the setting she required. Hunt had designed rooms that functioned as stages for social performance. The Great Hall could accommodate receiving lines of impressive length. The ballroom could host dances that continued until dawn. The dining room could seat guests in surroundings that matched any aristocratic residence she had ever visited. May intended to use every advantage these spaces provided. Summer 1893 marked the first full season at both completed mansions. Newport watched as the Golays and Vanderbilts tested each other's hospitality. Newspapers reported on entertainments at both houses, comparing menus and guest lists with the attention usually reserved for political campaigns. Society columnists understood that their readers craved details about this gilded warfare. Neither family achieved decisive victory. The contest would continue for as long as both households maintained their presence in Newport. But for the Golets, time was running short. Within 4 years, tragedy would strike in a way that no one anticipated, transforming Ochre Court from a stage for rivalry into a monument to loss. Chapter 9. Summers at Ochre Court. The Newport summer season lasted 8 weeks. From mid-July through early September, America's wealthiest families abandoned their city homes and converged on this small Rhode Island town to see and be seen. For 2 months, Newport became the undisputed capital of American society, and May Golay intended to reign over it. Running Ochre Court required an army. 27 servants worked inside the mansion, each assigned specific duties that kept the household functioning smoothly. Footmen answered doors and served meals, maids cleaned rooms and changed linens, a butler supervised the footmen and valets while a housekeeper managed the maids and kitchen staff. Cooks and their assistants prepared meals that might feed family alone at breakfast or hundreds of guests at dinner. The hierarchy was strict, the expectations exacting. Outside, another crew maintained the grounds that the Olmsted brothers had designed. 12 gardeners tended the formal beds, trimmed hedges into geometric precision, and ensured that flowers bloomed in carefully orchestrated succession throughout the season. When guests strolled the terraces overlooking the Atlantic, they encountered landscapes that appeared effortlessly beautiful. That illusion required constant labor. 8 coachmen and grooms staffed the stables, caring for horses and carriages that transported the family and their visitors. Newport's social calendar demanded mobility. Luncheons at one mansion, tennis at the casino, dinner elsewhere, perhaps a ball afterward. A single day might require multiple trips across town. The coachman waited in livery, ready to depart at a moment's notice. 47 employees in total served a family that occupied the house for just 8 weeks each year. The mathematics seemed absurd, but Newport operated by its own logic. Status required display, and display required staff. A mansion without adequate servants suggested financial difficulty or, worse, indifference to proper standards. May orchestrated this household with precision learned from years of observation and practice. She rose early to review menus with the cook, ensuring that each meal reflected the occasion and the guests. She inspected table settings before dinner parties, adjusting the placement of flowers and silver until every element met her standards. She knew which guests should be seated together and which kept apart, navigating social alliances and feuds that could make or break an evening. Her gatherings followed patterns established by Newport tradition while adding touches that distinguished Ochre Court from its neighbors. Formal dinners might include 10 courses, each accompanied by appropriate wines, the whole production lasting 3 hours or more. Guests arrived in evening dress, the women displaying jewels that represented fortunes in themselves. Conversation followed unwritten rules about acceptable topics and proper wit. Afterward, the party might move to the ballroom, where musicians played until the early morning hours. Daytime brought different obligations. Ladies paid calls on one another, leaving engraved cards at houses where the occupants might or might not receive visitors. The ritual seemed pointless to outsiders, but its intricacies communicated volumes about standing and relationships within Newport society. May understood every nuance. She knew when to be available and when to be conveniently absent, when to extend invitations and when to withhold them. Gentlemen occupied themselves differently. Ogden and his male guests might sail in the morning, returning in time for luncheon. Afternoons offered tennis, polo, or simply conversation on the veranda with drinks brought by attentive servants. The men discussed business only sparingly. Newport was meant for leisure, not commerce. Yet deals were struck, partnerships formed, and intelligence gathered during these seemingly casual encounters. Children appeared at prescribed moments. Young May and Robert joined their parents for certain meals and social occasions, learning the behaviors expected of their class. Governesses supervised their education and activities, ensuring they did not disturb the adult world that swirled around them. Summer at Newport was not a family vacation in any modern sense. It was a performance, and everyone had assigned roles. The expense of maintaining this lifestyle staggered imagination. Beyond staff salaries, the family paid for food, wine, flowers, musicians, and the constant upkeep that a 50-room mansion demanded. Linens wore out and required replacement. Silver needed polishing. Crystal broke and had to be matched from specialized suppliers. The bills accumulated week after week, season after season. Yet the Goles could afford it. Their Manhattan real estate continued generating income whether they occupied their properties or not. Rents arrived monthly, managed by employees who required no supervision from Ogden during his Newport retreat. The fortune that had built Ochre Court also sustained its operation, a perpetual engine of wealth that seemed incapable of exhaustion. May's success as a hostess brought rewards beyond social satisfaction. Her guest lists included European aristocrats, American industrialists, and political figures whose presence confirmed her standing. When she issued invitations, people accepted. When she appeared at others' parties, her attendance conferred legitimacy. She had achieved exactly what her father had hoped when he raised his children to marry well. The summers blended together in a rhythm of preparation, performance, and recovery. Each season brought new gowns, new gossip, new arrivals seeking entry to circles that May helped define. Ochre Court stood ready to receive them all, its rooms immaculate, its staff trained, its mistress prepared for whatever social challenges the weeks ahead might bring. Ogden seemed content with this arrangement. He had built his wife a setting worthy of her talents, and she performed brilliantly within it. He enjoyed the yachting, the company of friends, the prestige of owning one of Newport's finest residences. If the demands of social life sometimes wearied him, he could retreat to his study or escape to sea aboard the Mayflower. The summer of 1897 began like all the others. Staff opened the house in late June, airing rooms and preparing for the family's arrival. Gardeners coaxed the grounds into peak condition. The social calendar filled with obligations and opportunities. Nothing suggested that this season would be different from those that preceded it. But Ogden would not see its end. By late August, the master of Ochre Court would be dead, and everything the Goles had built together would pass into uncertain hands. Chapter 10. Death at Cowes. August 1897 found Ogden Goele where he was happiest. The Mayflower rode at anchor off Cowes, surrounded by the finest yachts in the world. The summer regatta had drawn its usual crowd of wealthy sailors and aristocrats, and Ogden had crossed the Atlantic to join them as he had done so many times before. The Isle of Wight in late summer offered everything he loved: sailing, society, and the company of friends who shared his passion for the sea. But something was wrong. Ogden had fallen ill 2 months earlier, and the sickness had not released its grip. He had made the voyage anyway, hoping that sea air and familiar pleasures might restore his health. Instead, he grew weaker as the weeks passed. By mid-August, he could no longer leave his cabin. Doctors attended him aboard the yacht, but their treatments provided no relief. On August 27th, Ogden Gilded died. He was 46 years old. News reached Newport within hours, transmitted by telegraph from England. Society reacted with genuine shock. Ogden had seemed vigorous just months before, a man in the prime of life with decades presumably ahead of him. Now he was gone, leaving behind a widow, 2 children, and a mansion that had barely begun to fulfill its purpose. May received word at Ochre Court, surrounded by the splendor her husband had created for her. The rooms that had hosted so many triumphs now witnessed private grief. She was 42 years old, suddenly responsible for everything Ogden had built and everything he had planned. The partnership that had produced Ochre Court had lasted 20 years. It ended in a cabin off the English coast, far from the chateau they had imagined would anchor their family for generations. Cruel irony marked the location. Cows had represented Ogden's happiest escapes from duty and business. The yacht that bore him across oceans had become his floating refuge, a place where he answered to no social calendar but his own. To die there aboard the vessel he treasured, surrounded by the waters he loved, the tragedy cut deeply. The sea had given him freedom. It had also claimed him. Obituaries and tributes dominated society pages on both sides of the Atlantic. The Prince of Wales, who had counted Ogden among his American friends, sent condolences. Fellow yachtsmen mourned a competitor they had respected. Newport's summer colony absorbed the loss as a collective blow, recognizing that one of their own had fallen far too soon. The Mayflower carried its owner's body back across the ocean he had crossed so many times in life. Funeral arrangements proceeded with the formality expected for a man of Ogden's standing. The family gathered. Tributes accumulated. And then, as always happens, the world moved on to other concerns. May faced a future she had never anticipated. Her husband had managed the family's financial affairs, maintained relationships with bankers and business associates, and made the decisions that kept their fortune growing. She understood social strategy intimately, but knew less about the real estate empire that funded their existence. Trustees and advisors would help, but the ultimate responsibility now rested with her. The children needed guidance through their grief and into their futures. Young May was 19, already moving in the social circles her mother dominated. Robert was 17, approaching the age when he would need to assume responsibilities his father had expected to teach him. Neither was prepared for the weight that had suddenly descended upon them. Ochre Court itself became a monument to interrupted ambition. Ogden had occupied his creation for only a handful of summers. The chateau he had commissioned to establish his family's position for generations had outlived him almost immediately. Every room held memories of a man who should have presided there for decades longer. Every gathering would proceed without the host who had made it all possible. Life at the mansion continued. Staff maintained their routines. The grounds remained immaculate. Summer seasons came and went, and May proved herself capable of managing the household her husband had provided. She hosted and entertained, fulfilling the role she had trained for since girlhood. But something essential had departed with Ogden. The partnership that had conceived Ochre Court could not be replaced. In time, the Mayflower found a new purpose. The yacht that had carried Ogden to his final anchorage was eventually acquired by the United States government. Renamed and refitted, she served as the presidential yacht for more than 2 decades, carrying commanders-in-chief on voyages of state. The craft that had embodied one man's private passion became a symbol of national authority. Ogden would have appreciated the elevation, even if he could not have foreseen it. For May and her children, the years ahead would bring challenges that wealth alone could not resolve. The son would need to become the man his father had been. the daughter would seek her own path through a world that offered women of her class limited options. The fortune that had built Ochre Court would need to sustain it through changes no one could predict. The gilded world that Ogden had known was already beginning to shift. New fortunes were rising, old certainties were fading. The 20th century approached with transformations that would make the 1890s seem like a distant, golden age. Ochre Court would endure, but the family that built it would never again possess the confidence of those first brilliant summers. What remained was stone and memory. The chateau stood above the Atlantic as Hunt had designed it, indifferent to the tragedies of its occupants. Waves continued breaking against the cliffs below. Seasons continued turning. And the question of what would become of Ochre Court passed to a new generation that had never expected to answer it so soon. Chapter 11. The Children's Fortunes. Ogden Gilded left behind two children who would navigate their inheritance in very different ways. His daughter found love and a title in Britain. His son found responsibility and eventually an impossible choice about the mansion his father had built. Young May Gole had grown up surrounded by the highest expectations. Her mother's social position and her father's fortune made her one of the most desirable young women in American society. Suitors would pursue her for her money alone, and she knew it. The challenge was finding someone who wanted her for more than the millions she would inherit. She found him at a wedding. In November 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt married the Duke of Marlborough at St. Thomas Church in New York, a ceremony that drew the attention of society on both continents. May served as one of the bridesmaids, standing near the altar as an American heiress became a British duchess. Among the guests was another young nobleman, Henry Innes Kerr, the 8th Duke of Roxburgh, who had traveled from Scotland for the occasion. The Duke noticed the bridesmaid. Something about May Gole caught his attention beyond her obvious wealth and social standing. They spoke at the reception. They met again at subsequent gatherings. A courtship began that would span years, conducted across an ocean through letters and occasional visits. Unlike many matches between American heiresses and European aristocrats, this one grew from genuine affection. The era had produced countless marriages where desperate noblemen traded titles for dollars, where young women found themselves trapped in loveless unions with men who viewed them as financial assets. May and her duke defied this pattern. They took their time. They came to know each other. When he finally proposed, she accepted because she wanted him, not because her family had arranged a transaction. The wedding took place on November 10th, 1903, 8 years after they first met. St. Thomas Church hosted another spectacular ceremony, this time with May as the bride. Newspapers reported the event in exhaustive detail, noting the guest list, the decorations, and the bride's elaborate gown. They also speculated about the dowry, with estimates ranging from $8 to $20 million. The actual figure was reportedly $8 million, a sum that would allow the Duke to maintain his ancestral estate in proper style. May became the Duchess of Roxburgh and moved to Flore's Castle, a sprawling Scottish mansion that dwarfed even Ochre Court. She brought American efficiency to the management of a household that had operated according to centuries-old traditions. She also brought treasures from her family's collection, decorating her new home with art and furnishings that connected her Scottish present to her American past. For 10 years, the marriage remained childless. In an era when producing heirs was considered a wife's primary duty, the absence of children caused whispered speculation. May endured the scrutiny with the dignity her mother had taught her. Then, in 1913, she gave birth to a son who would eventually become the 9th Duke of Roxburgh. The succession was secured. The family line would continue. May lived as a duchess for more than 3 decades, dying in 1937 at the age of 59. She had escaped the burdens that weighed on her brother, trading American pressures for British ones, finding happiness in a life she had chosen for herself. Flore's Castle still displays items she brought from America, tangible connections to the Gole fortune that made her transformation possible. Her brother Robert faced a different path. As the only son, he inherited primary responsibility for the family's holdings. The Manhattan real estate that had enriched generations of Gaulets now required his attention. The Newport mansion that his father had built now demanded his stewardship. Where May could leave America behind, Robert was bound to it. He prepared himself as thoroughly as circumstances allowed. Harvard provided education, travel provided perspective. When war erupted in Europe, he volunteered for service, eventually earning a captain's rank in the infantry. The experience matured him, exposing him to realities that Newport summers had never revealed. He returned from the conflict a changed man, ready to assume the responsibilities that awaited him. Those responsibilities proved heavier than anyone had anticipated. The world that had created Ochre Court was already fading when Ogden died. By the time Robert reached middle age, it had vanished almost entirely. 2 world wars, a global depression, and fundamental shifts in taxation had transformed the landscape for wealthy American families. Fortunes that once seemed inexhaustible now faced erosion from every direction. Robert married 3 times and fathered 4 children, building a family even as he struggled to maintain what his forebears had built. He served on corporate boards, including Chemical Bank, maintaining the business connections that respectable wealth required. He managed the real estate holdings as best he could, adapting to a world where the old strategies no longer guaranteed success. But Ochre Court presented problems that management alone could not solve. An estate of such scale, designed for 8 weeks of summer entertaining, made no sense in a world where domestic servants had become scarce and expensive. Heating costs, maintenance requirements, and property taxes consumed resources that previous generations had devoted to expansion. The chateau that had announced the Gaulets' arrival among American elites now threatened to drain the fortune that had built it. Robert watched other families face the same dilemma. Across Newport, mansions fell into disrepair or met the wrecking ball. Heirs who could not afford to maintain their inheritances sold properties to developers who demolished them for the land. The summer cottages that had defined an era disappeared one by one, replaced by more modest structures, or simply erased from the landscape. He would not let Ochre Court suffer that fate. But finding an alternative would require imagination, patience, and a willingness to let go of what his father had intended. The mansion's future lay not with the family that built it, but with an institution that could give it new purpose. That institution was already searching for a home. Chapter 12. The Weight of Inheritance. Robert Gaulet spent years searching for a way to save Ochre Court. Selling to developers would have solved his financial problems but destroyed his father's creation. Abandoning the property would have allowed decay to accomplish what demolition crews might otherwise perform. Neither option honored the legacy he had inherited. He needed a third path. That search consumed him through the 1930s and 40s. He consulted lawyers, accountants, and real estate advisors, exploring every possibility that might preserve the mansion while relieving his family of its burden. Each conversation revealed new complications. Tax laws worked against him. The market for grand estates had collapsed. Potential buyers who could afford such a property had no interest in maintaining it. He watched helplessly as other Newport landmarks disappeared. Grand estates that had once defined the coastline fell to demolition crews during the Depression years and after. Wrecking teams arrived, dismantled what previous owners had treasured, and left behind empty land worth more than the structures that had stood upon it. Names that had commanded respect became footnotes in real estate transactions. Such destruction carried a particular cruelty. These houses had been built to endure. Their architects had specified materials meant to last centuries. Their owners had imagined generations of descendants gathering in rooms designed for permanence. Yet within decades of their construction, economic forces had rendered them obsolete. The stone survived. The families could not afford to occupy it. Robert understood that Ochre Court faced the same trajectory. Each year brought fresh expenses and diminishing returns. Rental income from Manhattan properties that had once seemed boundless now struggled to cover multiple obligations. Taxes claimed an ever larger share. Maintenance deferred 1 year became emergency repairs the next. The mathematics pointed toward an inevitable conclusion. When the Second World War ended, an unexpected opportunity emerged. The newly formed United Nations needed a headquarters, and various locations competed to host the international body. Robert offered Ochre Court as a potential site. The grounds, the setting, and the scale seemed suited to diplomatic purposes. Perhaps the building that had impressed a Russian Grand Duke could serve the cause of international cooperation. Nothing came of it. The United Nations ultimately chose New York City, where John D. Rockefeller Jr. donated land along the East River for the organization's permanent home. Ochre Court remained in limbo, too valuable to abandon, too expensive to maintain, and now rejected for the one alternative use that might have given it global significance. Robert continued his efforts. Religious organizations sometimes acquired large properties for schools or retreat centers. Museums occasionally converted private residences into public institutions. Hospitals had been known to expand into donated estates. Each possibility required investigation, negotiation, and ultimately disappointment. The location, specialized design, and enormous operating costs discouraged most potential recipients. His third wife, Roberta, supported these efforts while understanding their emotional toll. Robert was not simply trying to dispose of property. He was trying to honor his father's memory, while accepting that the world his father had known no longer existed. Every potential solution required him to acknowledge that the Gaules could no longer be what they had been. The admission did not come easily to a man raised to continue a family legacy. Robert's criteria revealed his priorities. Any new owner must preserve the building substantially intact. Any new use must respect the architectural significance of what Hunt had created. Any transfer must occur in a manner that honored the family name, rather than suggesting financial desperation or social decline. He would rather watch the building crumble than see it converted to purposes that would have horrified his parents. These requirements eliminated most options. Developers wanted the land, not the structure. Commercial enterprises wanted to modify interiors for practical use. Government agencies lacked funds for preservation. The pool of acceptable recipients narrowed with each conversation, each rejection, each year of continued effort. By the mid-1940s, Robert had exhausted most possibilities. He was in his 60s, his children grown, his energy depleted by decades of stewardship. Ochre Court stood as it always had, magnificent and demanding, waiting for someone to determine its fate. He could not hold on much longer. Something had to change. Then he learned of a small Catholic organization in Rhode Island that had been looking for a permanent home of its own. The Sisters of Mercy had established a college in 1934, but they lacked adequate facilities to accommodate their growing ambitions. They needed space for classrooms, dormitories, and administrative offices. They needed grounds where students could gather and study. They needed exactly what Robert Gaulet no longer had the means to maintain. Nothing about the match seemed obvious at first. A French chateau designed for summer entertaining appeared an unlikely setting for a women's college operated by Catholic nuns. The Gaulets were Protestant, their social world entirely separate from the religious community that might receive their property. Ogden's original vision had never contemplated such a transformation. Yet the more Robert considered it, the more the possibility appealed to him. Education represented a worthy purpose. The sisters would preserve the building because they could not afford to replace it. Students walking through the Great Hall would experience something of what his parents had created, even if they understood it differently. Ochre Court would live on, changed but not destroyed. Conversations began, and for the first time in years, Robert Gaulet saw a future for Ochre Court that did not end in demolition or decay. Chapter 13, Education Saves the Palace. On March 15, 1947, Robert Gaulet signed the documents that ended his family's ownership of Ochre Court. The deed transferred the property to the Sisters of Mercy, a Catholic religious order that had been seeking a permanent home for their educational mission. Robert asked for nothing in return except one condition. The gift must be recorded as made in memory of his father, Ogden Gilded. The assessed value of the property stood at $312,000, a fraction of what Ogden had spent to build it. The discrepancy measured how thoroughly the world had changed since 1892. A mansion that had cost millions to construct now carried a tax valuation that a successful businessman might pay for a modest suburban home. Robert did not care about the numbers. He cared that his father's creation would survive. His wife Roberta contributed as well. She donated furnishings that remained in the mansion, pieces that connected the building to its original purpose. The sisters would inherit not just walls and floors, but objects that carried the memory of how the Gildeds had lived. Tables where guests had dined, chairs where visitors had sat, small inheritances that would remind future generations of what these spaces had once contained. The deed was executed on March 20th. Legal formalities completed a transaction that sentiment had begun years earlier. Robert had found his third path, the alternative to demolition and decay that had seemed impossible for so long. Ochre Court would continue, transformed but intact. The sisters faced an extraordinary challenge. They had chartered Salve Regina College in 1934, but had operated without adequate facilities for 13 years. Now they possessed one of the grandest buildings in Newport, a French chateau designed for summer entertaining, and they needed to convert it into a functioning educational institution. Every space required reimagining. Every corner needed new purpose. They divided the mansion by floors. The third story, where guest bedrooms had accommodated the Gildeds' visitors, became dormitories for students. Young women would sleep in chambers designed for society guests, waking to views of the Atlantic that had once greeted the wealthy and titled. The second floor, which had contained the family's private apartments, became classrooms. Lectures on literature and philosophy would echo through spaces built for personal retreat. The ground floor presented different possibilities. The formal areas that had hosted Newport's elite now served communal functions. Students gathered to eat where elaborate dinner parties had unfolded. They studied where orchestras had once played for dancing guests. The basement, which had stored provisions for summer entertaining, became a bookstore where textbooks replaced champagne. 8 sisters took up residence in the former servants' quarters. The women who had dedicated their lives to education and faith occupied chambers that domestic workers had once called home. The irony was not lost on anyone. A mansion built to display wealth now housed those who had taken vows of poverty. The transformation could not have been more complete. On September 24, 1947, the college welcomed its first students. The date held significance for the sisters. It was Mercy Day, honoring their order's founding. 58 young women arrived at Ochre Court to begin their education under the leadership of Sister Mary Matthew Doyle, the institution's first president. They passed beneath the arched doorway that had welcomed Newport's elite half a century earlier. They climbed staircases designed for social display. They found their dormitory beds in a building that had hosted royalty. Ochre Court was not merely part of the new college, it was the entire college. Every function that a university requires took place within those walls during the early years. Administration occupied offices in spaces designed for other purposes. The library assembled itself in areas never intended for book storage. Students, faculty, and staff shared a building that forced intimacy upon an institution that would eventually require much more space. Growth came steadily. The college acquired additional properties along the Newport coastline, expanding from a single mansion to a campus encompassing 80 acres. Other historic estates joined Ochre Court under Salve Regina's stewardship, each one rescued from the uncertain fate that had threatened so many Newport landmarks. The university that began in borrowed grandeur became a significant presence in Rhode Island higher education. Ochre Court adapted to each phase of growth. As new buildings absorbed functions that the mansion had initially housed alone, the chateau settled into a role as the symbolic and administrative center of the institution. The Office of Admissions welcomed prospective students in spaces where May Gilded had once received society callers. Wedding receptions filled the ballroom with celebrations of a different sort than those the Gildeds had hosted. concerts and lectures brought the public into areas that had once been strictly private. Recognition followed preservation. In 2000, Ochre Court received support from the Save America's Treasures program, federal acknowledgement that the building represented irreplaceable cultural heritage. The designation confirmed what Robert Goulet had believed when he made his gift. The mansion deserved to endure, and its survival served purposes beyond any single family's interests. Popular culture discovered the chateau as well. The 1994 film True Lies used Ochre Court as a location, introducing the mansion to audiences who might never visit Newport. A video game called Payday 2 featured the building in a virtual heist scenario. Most recently, the HBO series The Gilded Age filmed scenes within interiors that Hunt had designed more than a century earlier. Each appearance reminded new generations that such places existed, that American history included chapters of extraordinary ambition and craftsmanship. Today, visitors can experience Ochre Court, much as the Goulets' guests once did. The building remains accessible during academic hours. Its doors open to anyone who walks the cliff walk and wishes to step inside. The Great Hall still rises 3 stories toward its painted ceiling. The fireplace that Ogden imported from France still anchors the space it was meant to dignify. Light still pours through windows designed to frame the Atlantic. What has changed is the purpose. The mansion that announced one family's arrival among American elites now serves thousands of students pursuing education. The interiors, built to impress visitors, now host young people preparing for careers and lives the Goulets could never have imagined. The fortune that created Ochre Court has long since dispersed, but the building remains, fulfilling a mission its original owners never intended, but might well have approved. Robert Goulet died in 1966, having lived to see nearly 2 decades of the transformation he made possible. His gift ensured that his father's creation would not become another casualty of changing times. Ogden built Ochre Court to establish his family's legacy. Robert preserved it by letting that legacy evolve into something larger than family pride. On the cliffs above the Atlantic, the chateau still stands. Students pass through halls that witnessed Gilded Age splendor. Visitors glimpse a world that vanished generations ago. And the building endures, no longer a monument to wealth, but a testament to what preservation and purpose can accomplish together.